Are you looking for your next sewing project and do you want it to be an easy to sew up skirt? Well, if so, this is the perfect project for you. No zipper required, no elastic, a few straight sewing lines and some buttons up the front. And it's going to fit beautifully with the princess lines, and if you do need to alter it, it is super easy to do through the princess lines. So come on, let's go sew up this easy skirt and we'll have a skirt by lunch. Even if you're not sewing the skirt right now, you're going to learn lots of sewing tips and tricks and techniques along the way. First things first, you need to get the pattern. So download it at sewinganastasia.com. You can download it for your home printer or you can send it to a printer and do a large format copy. It's in sizes 0 through 26. Just be sure to follow the size chart. Just FYI, you can make this skirt out of any fabric. It's a 4-season pattern, so go nuts. Make it out of wool, cotton, whatever you want. After you print out your pattern, cut it out with your paper scissors, and then cut out your fabric. And let's go over what you should have after you do that. You should have 2 front facings out of fabric and 2 front facings out of interfacing. You should have about 8 buttons or more if you want to make it longer, or less if you want to make it shorter. You should have a back facing of fabric and a back facing of interfacing. And moving over, you should have 1 center back panel. And then you should have 4 panels for the sides. So for the side seams, we got 2 for the back and 2 for the front. And then moving over here, we have 2 front panels. And last but not least, you should have 2 strips of interfacing for your center front button facing. After you have it all cut out, you need to finish your edges. So you could serge it, zigzag it, or overcast. Or if you want to get real fancy, you could put French seams on it, or you could even do flat felled seams. And today, I serged the edges of my skirt. Now that you have your edges finished, you're gonna lay out your pattern and make sure you're matching up all of your notches so that way you know the right pieces are next to each other. So you're gonna have your front, your side front, your side back, your side front, and your front. And so we are just gonna sew up all of these nice flat seams, the ones that are right next to each other, lining up those notches, and make sure you follow your seam allowance at a 1/2 inch. But before we sew, let's pin our seams together. So we're gonna place our right sides together, line up our top, and put a pin in it. If you want, you can pin all the way down. I'm just gonna put 1 pin at the top, so I make sure I'm sewing the right pieces together. And now we are all pinned up. So remember, your seams are 1/2 inch, and make sure you backstitch at the beginning and the end of all your seams, and don't sew over those pins. Make sure you take them out before you get to them. And we're done with our seams. Now that you have all your seams sewn up, it should look something like this from the outside and something like this on the inside. Now we need to do some ironing. We are gonna iron open all of our seams so that way they're nice and crisp. And you could just do that, or what I'm gonna do is iron them all towards center back, and then I'm going to do a top stitch on all the seams, and I'm gonna sew them like that so that way it gives it a nice finished professional look. So we're gonna iron open the seam. Use lots of hot steam. Then after you get your seam nice and pressed open, we're gonna iron it towards center back. And the reason we iron it open first is so that way it ends up nice and crisp, and you don't iron any folds in it. So if I turn it over, you can see how nice and flat that seam looks. So I'm gonna do this to all my seams. So we do the top stitch. We're going to do this from the top of the fabric, and make sure you're sewing on top of that seam allowance. Again, just make sure your seam allowance is pressed towards center back. Back stitch at the top and the bottom, and let's get sewing. Again, this is an optional stitch. You don't have to do this step. You could have just left your seams ironed open. Or if you want to get real fancy, you could do decorative stitches down your seams as well. All finished. So let's check out what we just did. So you can see the top stitch on top of the seam allowance all the way down the skirt. So now it's time to iron on our interfacing. So So we're going to interface the long strips on the front panel at the edge. Just make sure you have the glue side face down. And then we're going to interface our back facing and our two front facing pieces. So I've got my muslin on the bottom, I've got the glue side of the interfacing on the wrong side of the fabric, and now I have another pressing cloth to put on top, and we are going to fuse the interfacing to the wrong side of the fabric. My iron talks. And now our interfacing is nice and fused to our fabric. Now I'm going to put the long strip right on center front on the wrong side of the fabric. And you're going to do that to both sides. So now that we have our interfacing ironed down, it's time to sew on the facings. So that interfacing is reinforcing the edge around the waist and where the buttons and buttonholes are going to go. So now what we're going to do is sew the side seams of the waist facing. So we're going to line up your notches and fold it right sides together. We're going to sew this side up a 1/2 inch and then fold this one in, and we're going to sew this one up a 1/2 inch as well. Don't forget to backstitch at the beginning and the end. Now that you have your seam sewn up, you want to head over to the iron and iron it open nice and flat. So now that we've sewn our waist facing together, let's go over how we attach it to the skirt with the front button facing. So we're going to line up the seams of the facing with the side seams of the skirt, and then we're going to pin it down. To finish the front of the skirt, we need to fold back the front button facing right where the interfacing ends, and then take the waist facing and overlap it on top of it. And when we sew it, we're going to sew over these two facings together. So it should look something like that. Now your interfacing should all be folded and pinned just like this. And now what we're going to do is sew a 1/4 inch seam all the way across the top. When you get to the end, backstitch and cut. Now that you have your facing sewn on, it should look something like this. And now what we need to do is flip the facing to the inside. But before we do that, we want to clip around the curve so it flips nicely. So we're going to put snip marks in it right up to the stitching line. Just make sure you don't snip into the stitching line, otherwise it's going to fall apart. And this is going to release the tension on the curve. So now we're going to flip everything to the inside. Flip your corner out, make sure you push your corner out. Actually, before you flip your corner, you should cut off some of the bulky fabric that's at the corner, so that way when you turn it, it's going to be nice and smooth. And so now you can also see by us folding the facing how it creates this nice overlap and finished edge here on the inside and at the top. So now that we have it folded to the inside, we need to iron it down because you can see how it does not want to stay down. Now that we have it ironed to the inside, it is staying there much better. But what's going to make it stay there even better? Doing an understitch. So we're going to do an understitch around the waist, and then we're going to stitch down the front button facing. To do the understitch, we want to make sure that our seam allowance is pushed towards the facing piece. And then we're going to do an 1/8 of an inch seam on top of the facing through all of those layers. And that's going to hold the facing to the inside of the project. And also, to finish the bottom of the button placket, we are going to open it up. We're going to fold it right sides together at the crease that we've ironed in there. And we're going to sew across the bottom a 1/2 inch just through the facing. And then when we flip it back, it's going to be a nice finished edge like that. And then we're going to sew down this button facing right in the serge all the way up the front. And then for the hem of the skirt, I'm going to fold it up a 1/2 inch to the inside and stitch it down. So that's just a simple hem. We're just going to fold it up a 1/2 inch and stitch it down. So I have everything nice and flat, and I have my seam allowance face towards that facing. And now I'm going to stitch through all the layers, creating an edge stitch essentially, which is called an understitch when we're stitching under the facing. Now to finish the bottom button facing, we're gonna fold it back at the crease that's already there, right sides together, and we're gonna sew up a 1/2 inch across the bottom. Make sure you're back stitching at the beginning and just come all the way to the edge of the facing. Don't keep going all the way down your skirt, so just the facing, and cut. And then it should look something like that. And make sure you clip your corner before you flip it right side out. And then when you flip it right side out, you're gonna have a nice finished corner. And you're gonna do the same thing to the other side. Now we're gonna stitch right in the middle of that serge, stitching down the front button facing. And now let's do the same thing on the other side. Now it's time to hem. And we're hemmed. So you're gonna notice the facing is still gonna wanna flap up at the waist. So what we're going to do is stitch from the outside, and we're gonna do what's called a stitch in the ditch. So the seam that's right here at the top, we're just gonna stitch right in the seam, and it's gonna look invisible, and you're just gonna stitch it down about 1 inch. And you just need to do it at the side seams. So I've got my stitch in the ditch foot on, which you don't have to use, but I think it makes it so much easier. And we are just going to stitch right in the middle of that seam. Back stitch and cut. Now do the same thing to your other side seam and your back princess lines. And if you want, you can do it to all the seams actually. And look at that, the back flap facing is staying down and you can't even see it from the front. Our skirt is looking great. Now it's the final touch of buttonholes and buttons. And I just love picking out buttons. There are so many fun buttons out there. So I chose these shiny purple faceted buttons and I think they look so awesome. That's why I did the purple contrast stitching on it, so it just pulls it all together nicely. So I'm gonna space my buttons out every 2 inches, but you could totally have fun with this and do 2 buttons, 1 button, 2 button. You can totally play with the spacing and do something creative as well. I'm gonna show you how to create 1 buttonhole and sew on the button, and then you can have fun spacing and placing all of your buttons. So I'm gonna be placing my buttonholes on the right-hand side, and I'm going to want to place them in the middle of my facing. So I know it's hard to see the stitching line, so I'm gonna draw it over here. So my stitching line's there, which means my facing is 1.5 inches wide. So I wanna place my buttonholes at 3/4 of an inch, so that way they're going down the center of my facing. And I also wanna start them a 1/2 inch down from the top waist. So right there at a 1/2 inch down and 3/4 of an inch in, I'm gonna put my first mark for the top of my buttonhole. Now, how big am I gonna make my buttonhole? I like to place my button on here, face down, line up the edge of the button with that line I just drew, and then go ahead and draw another line right at the bottom of the button. And let's measure that. How big of a buttonhole do we need? We need our buttonholes today to be 3/4 of an inch. And that's because I chose some big boy buttons. So I put my buttonhole foot on and I've got my buttonhole marked. And I'm gonna start at the bottom of the buttonhole. And I'm gonna do a manual buttonhole on my machine, so it's gonna go backwards first. I need to stop when I get to my back chalk line. I need to hit my reverse button and it's gonna come back down. We're gonna stop when both of the legs line up, hit our back stitch button one more time. It's gonna finish its final bar tack and we're done. It's that easy. Our buttonhole is looking great. Now I need to do that 7 more times, but let's open it up. So a really easy way to do this is take a pin, put it at the bottom of the bar tack, so that way you don't ruin your skirt. Go ahead and take a seam ripper, start at the bottom, and then push up through the center of it, and it's automatically going to stop at that pin, so that way you don't accidentally rip through your buttonhole. Now it's time to hand sew our button on. So let's go over how to place it and hand sew it on. But if you want more details on that, make sure you check out my other video on that. So I think the easiest way to mark where the button goes is overlap it where it needs to be. So overlap your button placket, take your marking tool and just go ahead and put it right in the center of your buttonhole. And then when you lift this up, you've got a spot where your button goes. So I've got my knot on the back of my button, and I'm going to start from the top of my project and go to the back. And we're just gonna keep working our way back to front. And this button already has a shank on it, so we're gonna go into the hole of the shank of the button every single time we go back to front. Now I like to go back and forth 3 to 5 times depending on how strong or delicate my fabric is. If I have a really delicate fabric, I usually like to make my button just a little bit stronger so it doesn't pull through the delicate fabric. And I always double up my threads so that way I have 2 threads, not just one, while I'm doing this to make it extra strong. And if you're worried about your buttons falling off, you can always use a buttonhole thread or a top stitching thread because that's going to be a stronger thread and it'll hold your buttons better. Now, once you go in and out enough, you're going to flip it over to the back. We're gonna take a little bit of fabric with the needle, and before you fully pull it, take the needle and go through the loop of thread that's still there. And I like to do that twice, and then I'll cut my thread. And now we have a nice, beautiful button. Now go ahead and make all your buttonholes and sew on all your buttons, and then you're finished, and then I'm going to try on my skirt and we're gonna check it out. We did it. We finished all of those buttons and buttonholes and they look awesome. So we have all of our buttonholes, all of our buttons. We have our beautiful top stitching on all the seams. We've got nice finished edges everywhere, including the facing at the top, the facing down the front, and our hem. And all of those seams that we sewed down are looking great too. And it fits great too. And if you like pockets, the pattern also comes with a rectangle patch pocket and a heart patch pocket. And those will look great on the front, or you could put them on your booty. I love the way the skirt has a nice fit in the waist and then it flares out. And it's such a great length to wear all year long. It's fitted, but it's not too tight. This is such a great pattern to add to your collection because you can sew it up all year long out of so many different types of fabrics. You can see how different it looks right now in blue versus yellow and purple. Crazy, right? You could even color block it because it has the panels in it. You could do lace overlay, make it a fancy skirt for an event. You have so many options to play around with this pattern to make it your own. Sewing up your own wardrobe is such a fun, rewarding process. You get to choose all the styles, all the fabrics, and put in all those little details to make it just you. And I would love to see all of your finished projects, so make sure you tag me at Sew Anastasia so that way I can repost them. And if you have any questions on sewing up this princess line button-up skirt, leave it down below and I'll get back with you as soon as I can. And don't forget, you can download the pattern from sewanastasia.com, sizes 0 through 26. And if you're not already a subscriber to Sew Anastasia, make sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell so you know when the new videos come out. And if you're already a subscriber, thank you so much for watching today. And if you don't already subscribe to YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, all that jazz, make sure you subscribe so that way we can stay connected and creative together. And don't forget, I teach sewing classes in my design studio here in Chicago, Illinois. So if you're interested in those, check those out at sewanastasia.com. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.